The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
Amateur Traveler, episode 897. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about medinas and Roman ruins and night trains, fashion shoots, snake charmers, and tagines as we go to Northern Morocco. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Northern Morocco. I know it may seem a little soon to do another show on Morocco because we just did a show on Southern Morocco last week, but this is a special episode of Amateur Traveler. And if you're a newer listener of the show, you haven't heard one of these because I haven't done one since the pre-pandemic. And the reason for that is this show, I will be the master of ceremonies, as it were, but I'm going to have 5 different guests on, and these are 5 of the 12 people in all, counting me, who went together to Northern Morocco on an Intrepid travel trip just a couple weeks ago as part of the annual Amateur Traveler trip, which is back for the first time since the pandemic. And so the way this works is I'm going to give you an overview of the trip we did, and then most of the time we're going to hear from the people who are on the trip about their impressions of this trip. The trip we're going to be talking about was done with Intrepid Travel, and this is not the first time we've used Intrepid Travel for an Amateur Traveler trip. I have personally gone with them to China, and then we have done trips with Amateur Traveler to Southern Morocco 9 years ago, to India, to Southern Africa, and to Cambodia. When I reference other Intrepid trips, that's what I'm talking about later in this episode. And the particular trip we did this time is North Morocco Adventure. If you go to the website, you're going to see that they've changed the order of the itinerary, but we did all the same things that you'd find in that particular trip. And so this is a trip that starts in Casablanca, then goes to Rabat, and then Moulay Idris, the Roman ruins of Volubilis, Meknes, Fez, Chefchaouen, Tangier, and then a night train down and ending in Marrakesh. And I'm going to do this slightly out of order. There were some people on our trip who did some pre-trips that I think are worth mentioning. And so we're going to cover those, but not quite first. First, we're going to give you an overall impression of the trip. And one of the things that this trip is about is the medinas. The medinas, that old part of town in any city that's old enough to date back to the Middle Ages, for sure, in Morocco has a medina. Medina just means city, but it's that warren of streets that is now shops, but people also live there depending on the city. But that's enough from me. Let's talk to some of the people who are on the trip. I have with me Holly and Sierra, who were in Morocco with me, a mother-daughter team and sometime fashion models in Chefchaouen.
Hi, Chris.
Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
What was the highlight of the trip for you?
For me, I think it was like wandering through the souks in the Medina and just soaking in all the action. It's like a beehive of activity with
Mhm.
other tourists and locals and motorbikes zooming by, donkeys, just
Yeah.
all the smells and sights, and just watching locals go about their daily lives and
More
people watching.
motorbikes in Marrakesh, which is a flat Medina, than Chefchaouen or Fez, which are lots and lots of
Yeah.
steps. But yeah,
Yeah. There's quite a bit there. Surprised. They really get really close to you.
actually, what surprised me wasn't even the motorbikes, but it was the people doing bike tours right through the busy aisles and
Mm.
such, thinking, "Huh, okay." Did you have a favorite Medina?
Probably Marrakesh, just because there was so much there.
Yeah.
I did Chefchaouen because it was so pretty, but I think Marrakesh just had so much more to look at and more cultural things going on, I think.
Yeah. In and around it, like the snake charmers on the outside, which was cool to see from afar. Street vendors with the food. That was really cool to see.
And we'll talk a lot more about Medinas, but the reason why I wanted to put this up front is that this tour is all about the Medinas. There are 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites that are visited on this tour, and 4 of them are Medinas, the 5th one being the Roman ruins in Volubilis. And so if you don't like Medinas, and there was certainly one person on the trip who just didn't see the attraction, this is probably not the tour for you. Let's go back and do this in a little more chronological order. We flew into Casablanca. Some of the people who were with me did some interesting pre-trips before the tour. So I'm talking to Mayor Barr, who went on this trip with me. Mayor, welcome.
Thanks.
5 years from now, you're looking at your pictures. What do you think is your fondest memory?
Can I mention Eswara, considering that was not on the
Sure,
trip?
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So Eswara was my pre-trip. I figured I would be whoppingly jet lagged since I haven't traveled internationally in about 10 years. So
Mhm.
I went to Essaouira, which is about 3 hour car ride west of Marrakesh on the
Mhm.
coastline. And I really enjoyed that. I think because it was small. The
Mhm.
town is small, the Medina is small, and it's very walkable. I had a tour guide take me into the Medina, and he did a really good job of helping me identify markers as to where I was
Yep.
and how I could retrace my steps to get back to my riad. So it was small enough to be able to navigate on my own. I didn't do the Fez Medina because I was wiped by then.
That is
But
larger. 70,000 people live there. It
I
is a warren of little tiny streets, and I felt that sometimes we were even going in circles.
would have loved to have gotten in on some of the history of that. I heard it was the oldest Medina, and
Mhm.
it
Mhm.
looked massive when we were looking at it from the castle. But Essaouira was also pretty windy.
Mhm.
But what I
There on the
heard,
coast, yeah.
yeah, what I heard though is it's very windy in the spring and the fall, but it mellows out for the summer. If you come in the summertime, you'll probably get hit by a lot of heat, but you on the coastline, it's probably a little cooler and apparently less windy.
And then Holly and Sierra did a pre-trip experience right in Casablanca. Now, Sierra, did you have the same answer as your mom in terms of highlight?
I liked it was a toss up for me between the hammam, the spa, and just like learning how to cook and cook the food and learn how to make the tea, things like that.
Okay. And when you say
Um,
learning how to cook, you did a special cooking class
yeah, we
just
did.
before the trip.
Yep. We added on a couple days before in Casablanca, and we did a cooking tour or cooking class with a lady
In
in
her
her
house,
home.
yeah.
Yeah, which was nice. We got there and she gave us some tea. We actually waited for a couple other girls to come too that joined our little class, and we all went to the market. So we got to shop with her, and she showed us where she shopped and like where she got her spices, and
Hmm.
it was educational to know because some of those spices look different from what we have seen. So she educated us on turmeric and chili paste and things that we don't really use a lot. And so then we went back to her house and we all cooked together basically. So it was a nice learning experience. We made chicken and vegetable tagine. And then we made a kefta. So like the
Oh,
meatball.
okay,
With
so you'd already had the kefta before we had it on the trip. Okay.
Yeah. So it
Which-
was interesting.
yeah.
She had us peel the tomatoes and taught us how to squeeze the juice out. And then she blended them up and she made her whole sauce. And it was fast. Like she did it very fast. And then while the food was cooking, we had more tea, some cookies, and then we all sat down and ate the meal together. So it was great.
And you had booked that through Airbnb Experiences or Urban Adventures? I don't remember.
That was Airbnb experiences also,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Excellent. And if you have a link for those, we'll put them in the show notes so that people can do that if they're interested.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
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 And then the tour gets started in Casablanca, but you don't actually spend any time seeing the city. So if you want to see the city of Casablanca, you have to do what many of us did and come in a day early or come back to Casablanca and fly out of there again from Marrakesh, which is what Julie and Anna did. And that will give you some time to see the city. For instance, there is a mosque in Casablanca, a very large one, the Hassan II Mosque, and that's the only mosque you're going to be able to go into in Morocco. So if you want to see that, you do need, I learned, to get tickets ahead of time. Otherwise, you're just going to see it from the outside, as I did. Although if you are exploring on your own before you've done the trip, if you haven't been to this part of the world before, it can be a little challenging. I'd like to welcome show Robin. What do you wish you had known before you went?
What do I wish I'd known before we went? That's a good question. I always wish I knew a little bit more of language. So even though I knew a little French, so language is certainly a piece of it. Maybe more of what to expect. I have to say, it wasn't what I expected. Don't quite know what to expect. I was first landing and being in Casablanca was a little shocking. Like I've traveled a lot of Europe and I felt like it was very different in Casablanca and I didn't particularly feel comfortable. So I wish I knew and that Medina was really a bit rougher. I couldn't look at anything or I was going to be engaged with a person who was going to try and sell me something.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right. And so how to manage that, I guess if there's anything I wish I'd known, like prepared myself to how to manage those interactions better.
Interesting. Having been places where it's a much harder sell, I didn't react that way at all to Casablanca. And of course, not my first time in country or not my first time in a Islamic country. So interesting to see it through your eyes.
Yeah. And to be prepared with certainly the money aspect of things and be ready for that. And
when you say the money aspect of things.
So, Chris, people prepare for trips differently, right? And so going to Morocco, we actually took cash. We took plenty of cash so we could exchange it. So, and then making sure we had enough money along the way. While things were cheap, actually things were inexpensive, it seemed, but yet we're reflecting on this yesterday. It throws you because while it's $10, but it's 100 dirham, it starts to play with your mind about how expensive or inexpensive is this. So that was getting comfortable with that.
But when the tour gets started, it just starts with meeting in the lobby, me handing out tour t-shirts to everybody, and then we took off for dinner. And that does bring up something that multiple people talked about is this is an active tour. Here's Robin again. And one thing you would tell everybody else before they go.
To Morocco.
Or on this particular Intrepid trip to Morocco.
It's active. And I think this probably depends on the tour guide. While our itinerary suggested we had free time and downtime, our tour was particularly booked pretty much solid with we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing. We kept moving and needing to keep moving. And it's a country that you have to be able to up steps, down steps. Hotels were steps to the hotels and walk a long time during the days. And so I think people need to know you're going to be busy and you're going to see the country. You're going to walk a lot. I loved it. I love that.
And you guys were ready for it, I think.
Yeah. And wanted that. I don't like sedentary tours. So that was good.
I think the first clue was the very first night. Okay, now we're going to go to dinner. It's a mile over here.
Yes.
It's just a mile. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're just going to walk. So we're just going to do it. Yeah.
And then the next morning, we got up early and went to the train station to take the first of what would be 3 train rides as part of this trip, including a long night train. I thought the train system worked pretty well in Morocco, but if for some people who hadn't done as much travel, the train stations and the bus stations can be a little challenging. Here's Mare again. Of all the places we went, when did you feel furthest from home?
I want to say the bus terminals and the train terminals. That's when I was really needing to look for things like the currency exchange or what identifying markers are you looking for when you're needing to find the bathroom and
Right.
or you're needing to find which track you needed to be on. So that really involved a lot of patience and observation and being willing to ask people for help that may not have English as even a second language. I think that was,
One of their
it
3
was,
or 4 languages that they spoke is.
I know that was something that I know Susan and I were standing at the end of one of the trains. We're waiting to get off. I don't remember. We were trying to get off into somewhere. It was not the sleeper, but I think it was like that 1.5 hour train ride.
Bez.
Yeah, I think that's when it was. And we were standing there with some other people and we were talking about languages, and there was a gentleman standing next to us who I could tell he was listening to our conversation because he had one ear pointing our direction, so I
Mhm.
could tell he was listening. And he just stepped in and said, "Oh, I know 5 languages." And I'm like, "What?" Now I really feel stupid. I've got my English and I have a little bit of French, which I got to come out of mothballs and use, which was nice. But yeah, that was the tough part, was the directions and the place where I seemed to need the most work to find what I needed to find. Everything else
Yeah,
was more, we had our tour guide with us,
right.
so
Yeah,
you
you
didn't have to work very hard for that in those situations. He already knew what to be looking for and everything. Thank goodness he was a native Moroccan, so he knew everything and was so helpful.
We took the train to Rabat, which is the current capital of Morocco. There are many modern buildings in Iraq, including the tallest building in Africa, but also some older parts of town as well. So we walked about a mile from the train station, not with our luggage. We left it at a nearby restaurant, ordered some lunch, and then headed to the mausoleum of Mohammed V, who is the last sultan and first king of Morocco. He had a key role in gaining its independence from France and Spain, and he's the grandfather of the current king. And so there were ceremonial guards at this mausoleum as well. And it's in the middle of an old, unfinished mosque from the 12th century. The caliph who commissioned the mosque died before it was completed, and his son did not want to spend money on his father's monument, and so they just never finished it to this day. And then we headed in the opposite direction and walked along the river because Rabat is on the coast there, and went to an old Portuguese fortress and old town there, including some beautiful gardens, the Andalusian gardens, which were built by Muslim refugees who had fled from Spain to Morocco after the Spanish reconquest. And then from there, we cut back through the old Medina of Rabat, which is one of those UNESCO World Heritage Sites that I mentioned. Went back, and all of this was before lunch. And then we had our lunch and then continued on the train to Meknes. But I mentioned that we did all that before lunch because, as we said, this trip is active and it did involve carrying suitcases up and down the stairs of the train station, for instance, which is something Holly and Sierra would want to make sure that you knew about. Are there anything else that you wish you had known before we were going? You mentioned all the steps. I know that was a surprise to at least a couple of people on the trip. You had clued in, Holly, I know, ahead of time.
Yeah, definitely pack light,
Yeah.
carry on, and be able to deal with your own luggage. You're gonna have to do a lot of stairs, a lot of walking, but
Yep.
yeah, just a carry on in a backpack, it was fine to navigate.
Yep.
There are a lot of stairs, a lot of walking. We calculated we did 76 miles that week, or the 12 days we were gone.
That sounds
That's good.
a little high. I know I was doing 10,000 steps a day at least. So
Yeah, we had a few days over 20,000 steps.
Yeah, it was good though. We got to see a lot.
my recommendation for this trip is that one, you be able to carry your own suitcase and carry that for, say, half a mile and up 2 to 3 flights of steps, and that you be up to doing about 10,000 steps a day, I would say, is typical, even though I also had a 20,000 step day. But that was a day before the trip when I was trying to see all of Casablanca that I could.
Konnichiwa, I'm Yuki, a tour leader with Explore. Who knew that hidden among Tokyo's towering skyscrapers was a peaceful tea house surrounded by ancient trees and serene ponds? Actually, I knew. It was my mother's secret sanctuary. Not everyone knows about Tokyo's Hamarikyu Gardens. Arigatou gozaimasu. But you will if you explore. Search exploreworldwide.com. And don't just travel, explore.
We got back on a train at this point and went to Meknes, but we didn't see it right away. We instead hopped in cabs. Interesting, the cabs in the different cities we're in are different colors in different cities. We hopped in blue cabs in Meknes and went out to Moulay Idris. And Moulay Idris is the first place that Islam comes to Morocco. And this is back in the late 700s, 789, when Idris I, who was a grandson of Muhammad, came and was fleeing basically a failed uprising against the Abbasid Caliphate, basically a Shia uprising. And so those problems that we see between the Shia and the Sunni Muslims dates back at least to the late 700s. And he brings Islam to Morocco and then also is considered the founder of Morocco. And so Moulay is an honorific that translates to our Lord. So Moulay Idris, our Lord Idris, is who this town is named after. It's on a hill, and the mountains here, the Rift Mountains of Morocco. Beautiful little town. We got to see the outside of the mosque where he is entombed, but because we're non-Muslims, we couldn't enter there. We did climb up the hill to see the sunset, or to see just prior to sunset. And then I think the most memorable thing is we stayed in a guest house in Moulay Idris, and that involved a cultural presentation. Some musicians came in and sang for us. And Jim, who is one of our members of our group, and our guide Ayub, put on what I understand to be a wonderful dance presentation, somewhat impromptu. And the next day, which is really just the second full day of the trip, we went to that Roman ruins that I mentioned, which is Volubilis. And our final narrator, Julie, had something to say about the ruins. I have Julie Locklear with me.
The one part that I definitely love too, if nobody's spoken about this, is the wildflowers just blooming all over the Roman ruins at Volubilis. That was absolutely gorgeous. So not only did we have the ruins that were spectacular, but we got to see the blooming wildflowers, which I think he said were really only there April and May, I think.
Yeah, for about a month. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that was wonderful.
And then from Robin.
And then my husband Jim being on the trip with me, I will share his, which was very close to me. Second one was Volubilis. Yes,
the Roman ruins.
And those were so different because of seeing Roman ruins out in the countryside. That was beautiful.
And the fact that we happened to see them during wildflower season when there were wildflowers everywhere, including the wildflowers after which they were named, I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I mentioned the city is named after wildflowers. It's named after oleander, as is the nearby town of Walili, which means the same thing in Berber. And our guide for the day was from Walili, and his father had actually helped excavate Volubilis, a beautiful town up on a hill overlooking the green agricultural land as it slopes down away from the mountains here in the Rift Mountains. It was inhabited for about 700 years, and most of the structures are low-lying. There's still a triumphant arch and part of a basilica, but then there are a number of different mosaic floors, and you can still make out the outlines of various wealthy homes and things like that in the area. This is probably a good time to mention that the landscape was a little surprising to some. Here's Julie again.
So, one thing that did surprise me was the landscape. What I read up about was obviously not anything to do with the landscape because I was expecting just a whole bunch of desert. And that sounds really
A lot of brown and not
a lot of
green everywhere,
brown.
and
Yes.
flowers everywhere.
Yes, and when we got off the plane and were driving to the hotel in Casablanca, it was green everywhere. And I was like,
Yeah.
I did not expect that. And like you said, flowers and plants. And we went up to the mountains. And in the northern Morocco part that we went to, we didn't even see any desert.
No, exactly. When this comes out, the show just previous will have talked about southern Morocco, and that is going to be closer to what you had pictured. Although
Yes.
even with that, when I was there the first time, I was there in a year that they'd had a lot of rain, and so
Right.
until we got the other side of the High Atlas Mountains to the south towards the Sahara, there were verdant green and snow-capped peaks and apple orchards and things that I didn't expect. So there's a lot of variety in Morocco. We then got back in taxis and went back to the city of Meknes. We had a brief visit to Meknes. We visited the tomb chamber of Moulay Ismail, who was the Sultan of Morocco in the 1600s for over 50 years. Meknes was a previous capital and is another UNESCO World Heritage Site. And we went from there into the ward of the Medina there, where we had lunch of camel burgers in a little tiny restaurant there before grabbing a train and heading on to the city of Fez. In Fez the next day, we started with pictures outside the royal residence. We did not get invited in, and then went to the Mellah, the old Jewish quarter. Now, this used to be a thriving Jewish quarter. In the 1940s, there were roughly 22,000 Jews in Fez, but after waves of immigration, now there are no more than 150 and no functioning synagogues in the city. But you could still visit the Jewish quarter, and then we went from there up to a fortress that overlooks the Medina. And this is the oldest Medina in Morocco, and it houses 70,000 people, and it has lots of different neighborhoods in it. We had a local guide for Fez, and you really needed it because I've got a great sense of direction, and yet even though I could tell generally where east, north, south, west were, I couldn't have necessarily found my way out with any readiness. So we had Miriam, who is our guide. You can learn more about her at her Instagram site, which is guide_of_Fez. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But she took us first, after we had the overview of the Medina from the fortress, we first went to a pottery studio where we got to see the pottery work that they were doing there. In Fez, we visited that. We also visited a place where they were weaving, and then also the dyeing street where they were dyeing the different cloth for weaving as well as some historic schools for imams in the city there, and then just walking through the streets and seeing the various shops and such, and the caravanserais inside of Fez. But Fez holds a few surprises, as Holly and Sierra point out. One surprise.
Sierra kind of touched on it a little bit, but especially in Fez, we're just walking down these little narrow rustic streets, and you turn down an even narrower, darker alley, and you come to this little door, and then we open it up, and it's like you're stepped into a palace for lunch. Right. There's ornate wood carving details and colorful mosaics, and this courtyard, and 3 stories, just the colors, and you'd never know what was back there. If we didn't have a guide to take us there, we would have never found it. And it's just surprising what's behind some of those doors.
Yeah, I think our guide in Fez said that behind some you'll find a palace and some you'll find a hovel, and you can't necessarily tell from the outside.
Even houses with pools and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, and a couple of the 2 restaurants we went to in Fez were both in Riyadh's. And then I think of also when we were in Meknes, when we had camel burgers, which was a unique experience for many of us, I think, and went to a nondescript door, no sign at all. You really have to know where you're going.
Yeah, that's where I think the guide on the ground helps a lot.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. The other notable stop in Fez that I'm surprised nobody brought up was the tannery. Tannery normally You see it in very colorful pictures, although my understanding is we were about a month early to get that color because they use natural dyes, and those dyes, like the late wildflowers and things like that, were not yet available. But also, it smells very bad. Apparently, pigeon poop is one of the things they use in the tanning process. From Fez, we went to Chefchaouen, and I'd have to say that Fez and Chefchaouen were the two places that I was most interested in, and why I picked this particular itinerary when people voted on Morocco. Because Fez, a very interesting and central historical city, and then Chefchaouen, just a very pretty city. It's the Blue City, and a much, much smaller city, so easy to get around without a guide. And Robin, what was your highlight from the trip?
For me, probably Chefchaouen. I just was taken with that adorable blue city. And we also got to walk around in the morning when it was really quiet, and it was just simply beautiful. So Chefchaouen was definitely the highlight.
With Chefchaouen, was there anything particular about it? Like the scale versus the Medina at Fez, or what was it that made you like that one better, or just the blue?
The blue, it made it very like quaint versus probably some of the other places that we had been or that we saw. I love at the base of the mountains there, the setting was just gorgeous. It felt like we were somewhat in the Rocky Mountains there. And the size, it was a little smaller to walk around. And I did find in general in Morocco, I was fascinated in reflecting back on the differences in all the medinas. Like every medina had its own character to it. And certainly Chefchaouen was very easy and simple and pleasant, and all that blue was just very well. And didn't they establish the blue? At least our tour guide told us they established the blue to help uplift your spirits. And it really was very calming.
I thought that was a great story where our tour guide basically said that the city was depressed both economically and spiritually. And the imams basically said, well, paint the city blue and it will remind people of paradise. And of course, the interesting thing is that because they painted the city blue, they now get a lot of tourism. So it raised the economic basis of the city as well. So it worked out well for them.
It did work out for them, for sure, for sure. And the blue makes some beautiful pictures.
Holly and Sierra did an interesting add-on experience in Chefchaouen. And then speaking of Medinas, when we were in Chefchaouen, I kid you about being fashion models, but you did an interesting add-on activity that you booked all on your own. Tell people what you did.
So we did a Airbnb experience. I didn't realize they had other things besides stay rentals, but they do have experiences you could book. This one was a photographer. It was very cheap, and he did such a good job. We just told him what days we were going to be in, and he worked out a time with us. So in the morning we got to Chefchaouen, we met him, and he took us around the Medina, the city, with all the blue streets and pretty views, and he took a bunch of pictures of us. And it was nice because he taught us how to pose, which we didn't know. We just honestly just paid for it and was hoping for good results, and they were great. He had our poses down. He would tell us, fix your hair here or your clothes here, things like that. And it was great. And we got the photos back
a couple days later.
So.
And they were fun. Which was funny because of what it was a day later, we were actually in the same Medina, and we ran across an actual magazine shoot with professional models, which is funny when you run into that in the real world. But
and they did say that Chefchaouen, that specific area, was what was the number one Instagram spot. Used a lot for fashion shows and models.
Yep, exactly.
We were a little disappointed they didn't ask us to join the fashion shoot after all our experience.
I would imagine that would be disappointing. And this is the last time I'll bring it up, but Chefchaouen, again, a very vertical city because it's in the mountains and it's built up against the mountains. And that included a walk for much of the group up to a spot to see a sunset of the city, and just even going through the Medina, lots and lots of steps. One thing you wish you had known before you went?
Oh, the stairs and the vertical. I got a couple travel books, one for all of Morocco, not just some of the cities that we were in. But I don't remember it ever mentioning a lot of vertical. Or if it did, it really didn't hit home. But that's really what took the biggest toll on me was the quantity of stairs, not only outside but inside the homes that are involved, and as well as the smooth streets. Some of them could be pretty darn vertical.
And especially in Chefchaouen, Moulay Idris, I think those were probably the most vertical. Marrakesh was pretty flat, but I think everything else was not, as far as I remember here off the top of my head.
Yeah, Volubilis.
Casablanca, also flat.
Yeah, Volubilis, Chefchaouen, they were all somewhere in the mountain ranges. So yeah,
Yep.
if you're headed into the mountain ranges, you need to be prepared. Get out the Stairmaster, find a tall building and walk up and down the stairs quite a bit.
Yep.
Eventually, by the end of the trip, I was able to handle them much better, but I didn't come into the trip as prepared as I needed to be.
Got it. I think I went into Chefchaouen expecting to be a little disappointed because it had been built up so much. And honestly, I loved the city. And it's someplace that I just love the photographs that we took there, both the fashion photographs and just the photographs of old doors and alleyways and things like that. Just a very beautiful city. From there, we got on a bus and we headed up to Tangier. And Tangier is on the coast. We didn't spend a lot of time in Tangier. We explored some of the coast. We went to the Cave of Hercules, which I will point out, no one pointed out as their highlight for the trip. That was more of a tourist trap. Got to one of the beaches and then again explored the Medina of Tangier, which feels like a newer city from that point of view. Tangier tends to get a lot of tourists coming over from Spain, less so the time of year that we were there. So it didn't feel like the Medina was quite as crowded as I hear stories of it being. And then we did a unique experience where the group voted for an optional experience where the bus driver had a friend who offered up her home for a dinner for the group that would be a traditional dinner.
Did anyone talk about, I loved the welcomeness of the people. I did feel like it was a really welcoming culture, even in all those restaurants, but also that night before we took the night train, the evening before we took the night train, and bus drivers' friends' home, that we're going into their home and having dinner, and then we're just hanging out there till it's time for our train. I felt, granted, they were using it as a business opportunity, but but so welcoming. And it was really neat to get into a home. So,
but it was interesting what they were saying is we were on the second floor of a 3-story home, and that the second floor was all dedicated to guests.
Yeah.
That was very typical, is what they were saying.
Yeah.
Is that you have this space so that you can entertain, so that you can have friends and family over. And they just extended that circle, may turn it into a business and extended that circle a little further out to us, but that it was the meal that they would have served anyway if they'd had friends over.
Yes.
That was a little different meal than we'd had other places.
Yes. Yeah. We did, the day after our tour ended, we did a cooking class in Marrakesh, and it was the same in that family's home. It was on the first floor, but just a big room, and we would
couches along the outside.
On the outside. And those tables, which why they don't make their tables a little taller baffles me, but the tables come right to your knees. But
so when I have been in nomadic tents, the layout is very similar to those rooms. And so I think what happened is you're a nomadic people, you settle, you build your houses, you build your room in a similar fashion. So it really reminded me of being in a nomad tent in, say, Jordan, for instance.
Yeah. Somebody I was talking to said that is so they can entertain. They want to entertain. You have to have space for lots of people to come over all the time. It's very entertaining. And that also people may end up spending the night and sleeping on those couches. So there's lots of space for people to sleep as well. Yeah. So they're very welcoming culture.
Julie, what was your highlight from the trip?
Honestly, I had broken it down into 3 different highlights. However, you told me just a minute ago that 2 of the things I was going to talk about have already been talked about by other guests.
Yeah, my guess is your real highlight, because I heard you say it afterwards, was that every trip from now on, you were going to schedule a hammam.
Yes, a hammam or whatever their traditional spa is in each country
Got
I
it.
go to, I'm going to. But I know that Holly and Sierra talked about the hammam, so I'll skip that, but it was wonderful. I just absolutely loved some of our meals. Getting to
Okay.
just sit down. I mean, I love food, period, but just getting to
Hear,
sit
hear.
down and just share meals with not just our whole group in the wonderful lady's home that invited us
In
into her
Tangier.
home in Tangier. That was absolutely special. And then also the restaurant we went to the one night, I believe it was in Fez, where it was family owned and they lived upstairs above the restaurant. Not only was the food wonderful, but it was
Right.
such a nice dining experience, welcoming us. It just felt way more welcoming than anywhere I normally go to eat. And we felt like we were family and we all shared the big plates together. And that was just a very nice, heartwarming experience.
Excellent. And then the second to the last night of the official trip was a night train from Tangier in the north all the way to the south into Marrakesh. And that made it easier for 3 of the group, who then went on down and did a 3-day trip into southern Morocco, down into Ait Ben Houdou and into the Sahara. I've done 3 different night trains now on Intrepid trips in China, in India, and now in Morocco. Morocco was certainly the most comfortable of those 3. For one thing, you had individual compartments with 4 beds in them instead of 6 beds and no doors in between different segments. And also the toilet was not a hole to the tracks as it was in those 2 countries. So that was actually relatively comfortable. But when we got to Marrakesh, some of the group visited the hammam, which we have alluded to numerous times so far. And then you mentioned the hammam. So a
Yes.
group of only the ladies did the hammam in Marrakesh in the Medina.
Yeah, oh my gosh. It was perfect timing because we checked around all our luggage for a week and bags were a little tight. So when the option was brought up for the hammam, we were like, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. It was different though because it's not what we're used to,
Sure.
mainly because we have to go in there topless in this room with your group.
Right.
Which was nice. At least we were private from other people we didn't know. But it was very nice. It was like old Riyadh that they turned into the spa.
Okay.
Once again, it was like just alleys and streets. When you open up door that you'd think is nothing, and it's this beautiful spa inside. So we get in and they serve us tea and some cookies. And then we sit there and choose our service that we want. And ours was planned out through the company already, but it was nice to see what all they offered. And then we changed into our little robes. We sit down and have some water. And while they were cleaning the steam room, then when it was our turn to go in, it all happened very fast. They just bring you in there and they wash you up, and then they let you sit and relax in the steam for 10 minutes. And they come back in and they rinse you.
Like a whole body exfoliation.
Yeah.
And
exfoliate you, let you sit in the steam again for 10 minutes. And the room was so nice. It was dark. They had nice music playing. They had, was it lights on the ceiling that looked like stars? Some fake stars on the ceiling. And then after that, you shower, you sit down for some more tea, and then they give you a massage for an hour.
Oh,
and
for
then
an
after
hour.
That,
oh, wow.
For an hour, yeah.
And it was probably would have been $300 or $400 in America, and it was 75 US dollars. So it was couldn't beat it. It was just relaxing. And after getting off the overnight train from Tangier to Marrakesh, it was just revived us.
You have the least pampering experience followed by the most pampering experience.
Right. Yes.
And then, of course, we spent time exploring the Medina in Marrakesh, which is a large Medina, also with a great big public square in front of it, where there are snake charmers, there are food stalls, there are musicians. And then at night, every night, they set up tables for what looked like pop-up restaurants. This was the second time I'd been to Marrakesh, but the first time was part of a Southern Morocco itinerary 9 years ago with a group of amateur traveler listeners. And that trip, I was planning on coming in a day early, but it didn't work out. So we showed up jet lagged. And the very first thing is we went into the main square and ate dinner in this just riot of color and noise and sound and massive people. And I found the Medina and Marrakesh to be a lot more interesting at the end of a trip when you're a little more adjusted as a country, a little overwhelming to jump right into there in the first part of a trip. But that's it. The official trip ends in Marrakesh. As we said, some people stayed on another day and did hot air ballooning and camel rides. And then 3 people went down and went into the Sahara and saw some of the sights in southern Morocco. I think it is worth spending some additional time in Marrakesh if you haven't seen it. It's quite an amazing city. We did go in and see a school in Marrakesh for imams again. That is a historic site there. We visited a spice shop where I picked up my Ras Al Hanout, a local spice there. I stopped at a local grocery store on Mayor's suggestion and picked up some caravan tea, which has a smoky flavor like it would have at the end of a long caravan ride when it picked up the smoke from the campfires, so that I can have something that I can drink in my office and remind me of the trip. A really enjoyable trip. We did cover a lot of ground, as you do with this trip. There are some things that I know that people weren't sure about going into this trip, and let's talk about some of those things that you may have heard about Morocco or some of the concerns you might have if you were thinking about doing this tour. Any other impressions that you want to share?
As a woman, was really blown away by how different Morocco was from what the books all say and all the websites and everything. They gave the impression that you could be harassed by men in the street if you weren't with another male or in a group. And I didn't find that to be the case whatsoever. There were comments that I needed to really watch my dress, my attire, and I didn't find that to be as an issue as all of the information led me to believe. The information had said that like Casablanca and Marrakesh weren't really going to be so much of a problem, but to be very careful in Fes. But I remember asking our tour guide, and at the time I had knee-length cargo pants and a t-shirt with long sleeve jacket on. And I said, are my lower legs going to be an issue? And he said, no. And that was something that I was looking at the entire time. I was looking at how the women were dressed. And
Great variety.
yes, yes. But even those who were in dresses, more modern attire, yeah, they were at the knee. You really didn't find anything higher than the knee. But there was everything from the women that had, I think it's the jalaba, the long dress or robe with the head covering scarf, but there were a few times where I did see a woman with her face completely covered with
Barely,
it.
but yes. Yep.
Yeah.
And then
And
you'd
there,
see a group of young gals like we ran into on the bus in Marrakesh where one would have the hijab, her hair covered, and
yes.
the other would not.
Yeah. And the men were incredibly helpful. There were a couple times trying to hoist that suitcase up over my head on the train or the bus, and I'm trying to get them down, or I'm trying to throw them up onto the train to crawl on, or throw them off. And there was always a gentleman, young and old, who were always incredibly helpful. Let me take that for you. Give that to me, and then I could crawl onto the train. So that was very pleasantly surprising for me.
I was a little bit concerned about the language barrier when we was first looking into it. Because I know there's Arabic and they speak French, but it wasn't bad. So that was one thing I guess I would encourage people to take the trip. If they're worried about that language barrier, it's not so much a problem. And especially with Ayub, our tour guide, he did a lot of
Right.
translating and got all our public transportation tickets, so that helped out a lot too. But even when we were without him, sometimes there was no one who ever got overly frustrated with us for not speaking Arabic or French. We had a taxi driver once give us his phone to try to use the translation thing on there, which didn't really work because we couldn't read what was on the phone. I could tell it was a translation app, but I didn't really know how to use it. It was different than mine, but it was still very kind.
I think too, if anybody's nervous, this was my first group tour.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was a little nervous about that. And if anybody's on the edge about that, I'd say do it. I mean, it was actually wonderful. I'm looking forward to doing it again. We instantly connected with at least 3 or 4 of the girls,
Right.
and then the rest of them were great too. And we met friends for life on this trip, and some we plan on traveling again with. So that was a good thing, I think.
Anything else that you want to make sure that people know about our trip?
I would. I've never done a guided trip like that with a group travel with a
Yeah.
tour company, and we went with Intrepid, and I loved it. I've done just not solo travel, gone with people, but planning my own travel,
Sure.
or gone on cruises, but I have never done a tour like that.
Small group.
Small group tour, and I don't think I'd like a large or really large group tour, but I did love
It's
the
different.
small group tour. Yes, the
Mm-hmm.
dynamics were great. I think that it was awesome because we had a great group
Yeah.
and just fun people, and it was so cool how we got to know each other, and I'm still communicating with some of the other people, Holly and Sierra. We text sometimes. And our group leader Ayub, he was just a fabulous person, and I would highly
Yeah, he was.
recommend small group travel.
Mayor had some suggestions about packing. Let's start with the highlights. What stands out for you now, having come back from this trip and only a week later we're talking?
I would say it's the variety
Okay.
of different weather. And I was expecting it to be a little hotter. Maybe
Sure.
we were just getting there in the spring.
I intentionally picked the time of year that we went so that we had mostly shirt sleeve weather, I would
Yeah,
say the whole time. And a few places like Chefchaouen better have a coat in the morning and the evenings.
yeah. So it was a challenge to be able to do not only nippy weather,
Yep.
but sweaty weather. But I was surprised that I was able to pack it all into a carry-on and a backpack. The thought about layers is
Okay.
really is important for Morocco.
And Holly had a comment about your diet. What's one thing that somebody should know? If you knew somebody who was going to go on this tour and go to Morocco, what do you think they should know before they book their trip?
For me, I think that bread is a utensil there. So I was on keto before I left, and that went out the window. Every single meal you're going to eat bread, but we walked so much it wasn't a big deal to indulge in it.
Yeah.
And then we also need to acknowledge our guide, Ayub, who made it a wonderful trip.
Just like for me, touching on the guide, I just wanted to say Ayub, our guide, was awesome. Our safety was his number one priority. He was constantly blocking traffic so we could cross the street and translating for us and making sure we didn't get ripped off.
I have a picture of you, Mom, and Ayub, and somebody on the street selling you something, and he's just right there next to you, just making sure you getting the good price. So that was nice.
No, actually, all the guides that I've had with Intrepid have been awesome. He was a little more green than some of the ones we've had. He hadn't done this trip as many times as some of the other guides that I've had, but heart of gold.
Yeah, he was definitely a gentle soul.
And Robin thought you should know this.
I think people being prepared that it's a pretty diverse country. From different cities were different, the crowds. And
then you went down to southern Morocco, which I think is even more diverse than what we had seen on the tour, because you did the extension of 3 days down to the Sahara.
Yeah, which was definitely different. But even on our part, each of those cities was so different. Fez, so different than Meknes, so different than Chefchaouen and Tangier. I thought they each had their own character. And I love that they each had their own color. Every city, even while Chefchaouen was blue, Marrakesh is red and Casablanca is white and Rabat was white. So I love that piece to it. So I think just people really realizing whatever part you go to, it's a very diverse country. And then certainly the southern part, when we went out to the desert, was phenomenal. It was great.
When I was on the tour of southern Morocco and we were a little more in the countryside, our guide would tell us about, for instance, that the boys and girls weren't allowed to talk to each other as they're getting into adolescence, and the courting was done more surreptitiously and such. But then he'd say, except in the cities, and then you see her riding on the back of his motorcycle. It's just very different from the city to the country too, which we didn't see as much on this tour because we were really doing mostly cities to cities.
Yes. Yeah. And once we got into the countryside, more Berber, there was much more Berber than in the cities. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How about, what do you think that people should know before they do this trip?
Okay, a couple of things that I think people should know. Morocco seems very accessible. I think that I didn't realize that before I went. My
Yeah.
travel experience includes some countries in Europe, Canada and Mexico, and then the Caribbean and Central America. So I've never been to any countries in Africa, Asia, anywhere like that. And I think I was a little nervous to go to Morocco. I didn't know exactly what
Sure.
my experience would be, even though I had read up on it plenty. But I feel like I could go back with a friend. I could go back solo and
Yeah.
feel okay.
Mm-hmm.
English is so widely spoken, and it just felt super safe and accessible, and they have a great traveling infrastructure. And
Yeah, they do.
yeah, so I think that it's great to go with a tour, and I really enjoyed that, but I could go back solo, and I would recommend that to people as well.
Okay. And then we're going to give Robin the last words for this particular episode. Yeah. What other answers do you have that I didn't ask the right questions to get?
Probably they'll be answered in my 3 words.
Oh, okay. I don't know that I gave everybody else 3 words. I forgot to do that. So
Chris.
Maybe you have to speak for the group here.
Okay. So my 3 words. So first is unexpected. I kept using that word throughout the trip as unexpected, but in many ways, to me, the diversity of the cities, of the landscape, like we got to the Rift Mountains, like that was so different than down where we were in Casablanca, but and then out by the sea, by Tangier, was so unexpected that it was all, I thought the landscape was different and unexpected. The unexpectedness of walking through all those medinas, and you are in these little alleys, and it seems maybe tight, or it may be not as clean as you might want. And then suddenly you're opening up a door and you've got a beautiful restaurant. When the one in Fez, it was the woman's home that she was born in, and now the restaurant, and she's still there. And just so unexpected that behind these doors, and where we had our lunch in Meknes and had our camel burgers, you open up that door. We walked forever through that Medina. And in fact, I think some of us got lost. And yet
our guide got lost.
And yet, a door gets open, and here's this adorable restaurant we're going to eat in. I found
no sign outside.
Yes, no sign outside. So unexpected. So that was one of my words, was unexpected.
Okay.
Diverse, which I've talked about. I think to me it was a much more diverse country and even culture than I expected. I said, except for the food. The food is not that diverse. In fact, one guide said to us, so he goes, yeah, there's tangine and couscous. And you have tangine, and you get tired of tangine, you have couscous. And then you go back to tangine. No diversity in the food. And then the third word is yella yella. Yella yella.
Oh, yes.
Our tour guide continuing to tell us, and it meaning hurry up slowly. And I love that.
Hurry up slowly, yeah.
I think that's
hurry up, but be careful where you step.
Yeah. And I do think that even from a mindset, I thought was a reflection of their culture. Hurry up, okay, let's get going, but don't rush yourself. Like, still enjoy this. So I thought that was pretty good.
Excellent.
Yeah. And I'm also going to share that the thing that I would say only in Morocco would be cats.
Oh my gosh, cats everywhere.
Cats. I've never seen so many cats in my life.
I have a video from Chefchaouen of a woman on the 3rd floor of her house opening up little cheeses and dropping them 3 floors down to about 6 cats in the alleyway. And my impression is they are just the local cats. These aren't her cats. And she's just feeding the local cats. And like,
Yes.
okay, then.
Yes. Yep. All the cats. And in one of the medinas, actually in Casablanca, our first night in the medina, there were 4 men. They were all huddled around a little kitten and feeding this little kitten. And I'm like, wow, they clearly value these cats in taking care of them, which I never quite got a reason why, but they do.
I think some was just keeping down the vermin, and some was they're cats. They're cute.
Yeah.
But yes, there were a lot of cats. Some of them were and some of them weren't. That's true. And my thanks to the wonderful group of people who made this a terrific trip. I have to say, it still strikes me as just a little insane that I let people vote on where I go on vacation for 1.5 weeks a year or something like that. But it works out. It's a great group of people. At the time when I'm recording this, I think the Cuba trip is almost filled up, including 2 friends who traveled with us on the Amateur Traveler trip to Central Europe, and 1 friend who was there for the Cambodia trip, and 3 of the members of this tour group who are coming back again next year, and I'm looking forward to it already. A special thanks to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. And remember that patrons of the show get the first chance to sign up for any of the annual Amateur Traveler trips. If you're interested in learning more, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. A fun thing that has happened here over the last year is Amateur Travelers increasingly getting included in airline entertainment systems. And so if you have heard about Amateur Traveler on Lufthansa or Mauritius or Oman or South African Airways or KLM or Air India, welcome to the show. And please do let me know if you heard about the show that way, because I'm just curious how many people actually have discovered the show through their airline entertainment system. I had a recent review of the show from Chauvelin7 Adam, who said, Guzel ve zevkli, bu guzel ve sevkli shovu beyendim. My apologies for my Turkish pronunciation there, but that was beautiful and tasteful. I enjoyed this beautiful and enjoyable show. I think the only appropriate answer is teşekkürler. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.